Well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Caro, and I'm the Public Affairs Officer at the U.S. Consulate General in Montreal. It is my great pleasure to welcome you to our very first program on diverse games, great stories, a conversation with the creators of the video game Never Alone. Today's discussion will focus on diverse perspectives in video game storytelling, explore the inclusive development process of making Never Alone, and the adaptation of traditional stories to a new medium. For those of you who may not know, Never Alone was the first video game made in collaboration with an Indigenous community. Almost 40 Alaska Native storytellers and elders contributed traditional stories of the Inupiat people to help creators, Gershenfeld and Amy Fredeen, bring Alaska Native culture to life on screen. The impact of Never Alone has been felt throughout the gaming community and around the world. It is relevant now more than ever as governments and communities grapple with their own history and search for new ways to showcase First Nations stories and their unique voices. We were incredibly saddened by the discovery of the remains of 215 Indigenous children at the former residential school in Kamloops, British Columbia. This tragic discovery is a reminder that we have much to learn from the past, and as we all work towards creating more just societies. I believe many of you already know the power of video games to build an experience of deep empathy and greater understanding, to transport us to new worlds and expose us to new ways of thinking. I hope you leave today believing in your ability to create games like this. So it is my pleasure to introduce our moderator for today's event, Professor Pierre Tousignant from l'École des Arts Numériques, de l'Animation et du Design, or the NAD Institute here in Montreal. Pierre has been working in 3D animation since 1993 and has been teaching at NAD since 2007. He also supervises the NIC-NAD project in collaboration with the First Nations Centre Nicanit at the Université du Québec à Chicoutimi. This program helps First Nation students complete their university studies, as well as teaches non-Indigenous communities about First Nations populations. One of the games that students recently studied was Never Alone. Pierre, we are so happy to have you with us today, and I will turn it over to you.
Welcome, everyone. So as Mrs. Caro said, I will be the moderator today. First of all, I would like to extend a very warm thank you to the Embassy Consulate of the United States of America in Canada for organizing the Diverse Story Great Games or Diverse Game Great Story. I think I have mixed up my wire here. So it's an honor for me to be here. Basically, the way it's going to go today is Alan and Amy are going to speak first for about 20-25 minutes, making a presentation. After that, we're going to open the floor for questions. A quick introduction. If you have any question, please use the chat function in Zoom or the QA function, and we will take your question and later on ask them to Alan and Amy. So a quick introduction Alan Gershenfeld is the president. So one of our two speakers is the president and co-founder of E-Line of Media, a leading publisher of games that inspire players to connect with the world and each other. Alan has worked on impact game project with the Gates Foundation, the MacArthur Foundation, the NSF, the USAID, DARPA, White House OSTP, the Cook Inlet Tribal Council, Game for Change, Google, Sesame Workshop, and many, many more. E-Line is the developer of Never Alone. We talked about it. A game made inclusively with the Alaska Native community that has reached over 4 million players, won a BAFTA award and a Game of the Year award at Game for Change. Alan was previously a member of the executive team that rebuilt game publisher Activision from bankruptcy into an industry leader, overseeing titles such as Civilization, Call to Power, Muppet Treasure Island, Tony Hawk's Skateboarding, Spycraft, and Zork. He has spoken on games, learning, social impact all over the world, including the World Economic Forum in Davos. Alan is also the co-founder of Experimental Design, a pioneer of world building to help design and build preferred futures. He also served as on the board of Filmmate International Advisory Board of PBS Kids, Next Generation Media, iCivic, Joe and Gones, Cooney. He is a former chairman of Game for Change. Sorry about this. And Game for Change. Quite an impressive CV, Alan. Amy Fredeen is of UQAC descent and served as the Chief Financial Officer and Executive Vice President for Cook Inlet Tribal Council, CITC, where she has grown the organization unrestricted fund by over 1,000% in a 6-year period. Let me repeat that, 1,000%. This strategic growth and careful stewardship of funding has allowed the CITC to take leadership role in fiscal excellence. She's a pioneer in strategy to increase investment in indigenous communities through social enterprise, innovation, and partnership. Through the CITC for-profit subsidiary, Ms. Fredeen helped form a partnership with Eline Media, an industry leader in educational game, and together they created Never Alone, the first video game made with an indigenous community. Again, very impressive. So, Alan, Amy, the floor is yours.
Well, hello, I'm so excited to be here today. Again, my name is Amy Fredeen and I'm a NUPIAC. I'll introduce myself in the traditional way for the NUPIAC culture, which is through my family lineage. I'm the daughter of Gardenia and William Schmidt, and my grandparents were from the Mary's Igloo and Teller area in Alaska. And so I'm here today to talk about Never Alone, and I know we're gonna have a slideshow starting, but I wanted to give Alan a brief chance to say hi to you.
Hi, it's great to be here. Always love to chat with folks about Never Alone and to do it with Amy.
Well, while we're waiting for the slideshow to start, I'll go ahead and start talking about the genesis of Never Alone. And so Never Alone, which in NUPIAC is Kisima Ignikuna, which literally means to not walk by yourself in NUPIAC, was really about connecting our children and our youth with our mission in new and innovative ways. So my role on Never Alone was to be the lead cultural ambassador, and I'll talk a little bit about what that meant later on in the presentation. But let's start off by going to the next slide and talk about what I do in my day-to-day job. As Chief Financial Officer of Cook Inlet Tribal Council, we serve Alaska Native and American Indian individuals in the urban area of Anchorage, Alaska. And if we can progress to the next slide, that'd be great. So our whole role in our community, it being in an urban setting, is to connect our people with their potential. And we've been doing this for over 40 or 30 years now. And we have 400 passionate employees that are dedicated to connecting our participants with their potential. And we serve about 20,000 individuals a year. So our role in the community is very critical. We are here as a bridge, particularly as individuals move from their home villages into Anchorage or are preparing to exit and move back to rural Alaska, is that we're here to really help them define their own self-sufficiency. And we do this in a number of ways as a tribal nonprofit organization. We operate employment and training, education services, child and family services, and recovery and reentry services. And we do a lot of advocacy. And we do this through a family of 7 companies, nonprofits, and our one for-profit, CITC Enterprises, Inc. And what the whole goal of what we do is to help our people define their own self-determination through self-sufficiency. If it's possible to progress to the 3rd slide, that's great. If not, I'll keep going. So as a tribal organization, about 15 years ago, when I entered into my role as CFO, we were an organization that was doing great work in the community, but we were kind of acting like an arm of the federal government, which isn't a bad thing, but it wasn't everything we could be. So at that time, we were about 95% funded by the federal government, and the board said, well, we want to change that. If we're asking our people to connect to self-determination through self-sufficiency, we need to do that as an organization too. So we set out on a goal to create our budget that was really anchored in earned income streams. So they wanted us to go from 95% federal funded to 50% self-generated and earned income streams. We're making progress on that. I'm happy to report that we're about 40% self-generated and self-funded as a tribal organization, and our budget has grown to a gross consolidated level of 150 million over the last 15 years. And that wasn't done alone. And so as we look at kind of where we were going to focus, it was really about finding partners, finding the people in the community that could help us build opportunities for our participants. We had been operating social enterprises since they were open, with coffee shops and janitorial services and building maintenance services, kind of the typical type of startup companies you see nonprofits launch for social enterprises. But what we discovered is we weren't connecting with our youth. This is a vastly fast-growing part of our population as Alaska Natives, and we weren't helping them connect to their potential through social enterprises. So we kind of shifted how we thought about social enterprise. It didn't necessarily have to be the traditional social enterprises we saw in our community. And so we wanted to harness the power of technology and innovation and bring it into our community and connect our youth to it. So we had just embarked on a new strategic initiative to start impacting investing. And so we were literally sitting around the lunch table one day with my boss, Gloria O'Neill, who's the president and CEO of CIC, and we're kicking around ideas of what we could invest in. Literally, we talked about everything from cradle to grave, you know, childcare centers, burial services, to really boring real estate holdings. And what we discovered is that none of those ideas were going to connect with our youth. So my boss said, why not video games? And as CFO, my role is to protect the company's resources. I raised my hand and said, I know why not video games. They're expensive, they're risky. We don't know what we're doing. And did I mention they're risky? But what is great about CIC as an organization is we don't accept barriers in front of us. And so when we see something that is a barrier, we look at how we fix it. So in this scenario, it was all about de-risking it with good partners. So if we go to the next slide, one of the things we realized is we didn't know the video game space. So we sent our then Vice President of Social Enterprise, Pitta Benz, to a ton of video game conferences to learn about the industry and find partners. Really, what we saw through all of those conferences and talks was that Eline Media kept popping to the top of that list. And so they were out there making games and making impact with a focus on educational games. And so we literally cold called them and invited them to Alaska. And Alan, I don't know if you want to talk about kind of getting that first call from us.
Sure, thanks, Amy. Do you want to go to the next slide? So as Amy mentioned, we're a developer and publisher of games that we want to make entertaining, we want to be profitable, but that we really want to empower, especially youth. We started by doing a lot of games with government agencies and foundations, trying to harness the incredible power of games for some sort of learning, health, or social impact. And actually started mostly in the school channel with a game that teaches kids to make games, the educational version of Minecraft. But we had worked on games and civic engagement in the Middle East. We had worked in refugee camps and sustainable farming. When we got the call from the Cook Inlet Tribal Council, we were very excited because we actually hadn't done a consumer-facing game that was an impact-focused game that was primarily to compete in the consumer channel, which is every channel is hard, but that's particularly hard. So we were particularly excited, and we were fascinating that the call was coming from this fascinating Alaska Native tribal organization. And when Pitta first called, it was interesting. They had asked us to come up to Alaska for a weekend. It was, as Amy will agree, a blizzard. So it was sort of a little bit of a test. Would we come up to really just talk to them about, is this viable? Does this make sense? My business partner, Mike Ongst, had been to 49 states. He had never been to Alaska, so we could check that one off. And we were just excited by the potential. Do you want, next slide, please? When we start a project, we always start with a landscape and opportunity analysis. So when we first went up there, we a little bit like Amy, we tried to almost talk them out of it, because putting a couple $1 million into a single video game is a very risky investment. And we felt a huge amount of responsibility just to be very clear about how risky it is. But we really hit it off with Amy and Gloria and Pitta and the team there. It was interesting. Their leadership was all women. Our leadership was all men. We came from very different worlds, but we shared a very similar set of goals, which is harnessing this incredibly powerful medium for a positive cultural impact. So instead of saying yes or no, we agreed to do a couple-month landscape and opportunity analysis and really studied Indigenous games in other media, as well as video games, and looking at it from a commercial lens. Is there an opportunity to make money and make impact? You want to go to the next one? You know, you had mentioned in the intro that we were the first Indigenous game. I mean, that's not really true. There had been a number of different Indigenous games, really remarkable Indigenous games, but not necessarily in the consumer channel, not necessarily games that were seeking to reach a global audience, millions of players, and be profitable. I think that's something that was relatively new. However, there's been amazing Indigenous game makers doing really interesting games, often for their own communities, that we studied and were fascinated. But when we looked at Indigenous representation in other games, and often in other media, we sort of created this rubric. Often there was just straight out appropriation that was very offensive and very hurtful and very inappropriate. Sometimes there was just random sampling where there would be Indigenous characters, and it wasn't really exaggerated or hurtful, but it had no context and was not really thoughtful. They were often very literal representations, and they were less designed for a broad entertainment consumer audience, but often very specifically for an educational or internal use. And so it was very interesting to look at how it was done. Next slide, please. We also, when we interviewed a lot of gamers and platforms for releasing games, we found that there was a real intersection of indie gamers that, you know, sometimes you want to play, sometimes you want to go watch a superhero movie or play a big budget AAA game, but sometimes you want kind of really meaningful content that really challenges you. And we saw this intersection of indie gamers and cultural creatives. These are the folks that would go see a movie like Whale Rider, an absolutely wonderful movie, or listening to world music. Or in the game side, really look at games that brought that kind of not just push the boundaries of the art form, but really push the boundaries of themes and perspectives. Next slide, please. So we decided that if we could build a team that on the Alaska Native side of elders, writers, storytellers, community members, and on the game side, people who have built very successful commercial games, but are deeply committed to an inclusive development process, where we often say it's not making a game about the Alaska Native community, it's making a game with them in every way, from the design to the development to the problem solving, and games are hard, all the way to the development, the marketing, financing, that everything is done together and inclusively. So we had to build the team. Next slide, please. On the game side, as Pierre had mentioned, I used to run Activision Studios. One of our top designer directors from games like MacWarrior 2, Pitfall, Interstate 76. After Activision, he went on and ran Tomb Raider, which is a very large commercial franchise. He had recently left Eidos and the Tomb Raider franchise and was kind of deciding what he wanted to do next in his career, was looking for an opportunity to do really meaningful content. He met Amy and Gloria at the Inlet Tribal Council. They sent him many stories that had only recently been written down, that had been passed orally for hundreds, if not thousands of years, which is fascinating. Like, why do these stories last so long to help one generation guide another? And he agreed to come on board, and together we would build an entire team of industry veterans, new talent, really ready to go on this inclusive development process. Next slide, please. And Amy, do you want to talk a little bit about building the Alaska Native team?
Yeah, and so this is where I talk a little bit about what it means to be a cultural ambassador on projects like this. And so as lead cultural ambassador, literally my job is not to have all the answers. And so my job is to bring the right voices to the table. So we gathered elders, youth, and artists and subsistence hunters from Northern Alaska and the community of UQAC, then previous called Barrow, Alaska. And they really helped inform the decision-making process. And so I think part of making a game meant that we had to teach Eline Media about the Inupiaq culture, our stories, and our values. But they had to teach us about making games. And so throughout the game making process, there were a lot of really interesting conversations and ones where we had to pause and say, well, wait a second. We need to discuss about like, what does it mean to portray death in a video game? And who do we go talk to in the community? So the people you see on the screen here were some of the people involved and represented as cultural ambassadors throughout the video game. And you'll also see them, and we'll talk a little bit about the cultural insights. But really the idea is that as a tribal organization, it was not appropriate for us to take the only lead and have the only voice in a video game making endeavor about our stories and our values. And so we wanted to include the entire community. And I'm not sure what Eline thought about when we said, well, let's bring the community in. I'm sure it posed a lot of really interesting challenges, but I think it was one of the most wonderful experiences I've had in my life. Alan, I don't know if you want to talk a little bit about how working with this many Alaska Natives and really the entire community of UQAC, how that impacted the development.
It was absolutely amazing, and it's what made Never Alone Never Alone. You know, there's no way to make a game like Never Alone without spending a lot of time in Alaska on the Arctic slope, both formally and informally, hanging out with the community. So many of the insights that we learned that are in the game that we'll talk about came from just spending time, having dinner, hanging out, talking. And I would say on the other side, it was fascinating when our Alaska Native partners came to game conferences and saw the sort of crazy culture of the game conferences. And so, you know, we did everything where we were in the same shoes, but really it was fascinating to see each of our cultures through each other's eyes. And there were a lot of challenges as well, which when we get to the Q&A, we're happy to talk about some of the challenges and how we navigated them, both on the cultural side and on the game side. Should we go to the next slide? So, you know, we talk about the inclusive development. And one of the things that really emerged from the very beginning as the North Star for the game and the franchise is really the word interdependence that you see at the bottom of the slide. The game itself is a two-player local co-op game. You play Noon and Fox to reinforce interdependence. You can't play the game and finish it alone. And it's most fun when you play two people side by side. Interdependence among people, interdependence between people and nature, interdependence between the world around us and the spirit world. That's how the Alaska Native community has survived in one of the most harsh but beautiful climates in the world. It's how our game was made. We were interdependent. They couldn't make the game without us. We couldn't make the game without them. So interdependence was sort of the North Star of inclusive development. And again, we can talk through all the tactics if that comes up in the Q&A. Next slide. Amy, do you want to talk a little bit about the IP?
I would love to. First, let me acknowledge who you're seeing here, the beautiful Minnie Gray. She is a culture bearer and storyteller in her own right. And she's actually who we worked with to really honor how our stories are passed down from generation to generation. So when you're working in a media project like this, you of course have to address the Western type IP legal rights. But we also wanted to make sure that we really honored the oral tradition and the caretaking of our stories. So Robert Nashville Cleveland was the storyteller most known for the Kunuksayuka story, which really provides the spine of the gameplay for Never Alone. So it's literally the endless blizzard story. And so Robert had passed away, and we knew Minnie Gray was his eldest surviving child. And as the eldest, she had a caretaking responsibility for these oral stories, which included the Kunuksayuka story that Robert had told. And so we literally looked for months for Minnie. We knew she was from Ambler. She lived in Fairbanks for a bit, and she lived in other parts of Alaska. So we looked everywhere, and it just so happens that her daughter was connecting to CITC, seeking out opportunities through one of our programs. And so for 3 months we've been looking, and her family was right there. And I'm so happy that Minnie lived just a few blocks away from our offices. So I was able to go have tea and have smoked fish with her and really talk about making of the game. And I have to be honest, I was nervous because here's Minnie Gray, a well-known elder and who's very respected. I'm going to be going and asking her, can I take this story and work with a team to make a video game around it? I didn't know what her reaction was going to be, but you know, we sat in the living room of her apartment and she looked around at her grandkids and her great grandkids that were running around. She's like, of course you should do this. This is how they're going to hear that story. And we worked with her throughout the process. So we walked through an agreement with her that secured the Western rights, but honored her role and voice in the process. And we did things like, as we started building out the game, we gained her permission to weave in other recurring themes from Alaska Native stories. And her response to my question on, can we do this? Can we change the story? Was, you should be able to change the story, because for the Nupiaq people, the storyteller would change the story if they knew someone in the audience or who was hearing it needed to hear a specific message. So it was amazing and wonderful to be able to work with Minnie. And I think part of what we were able to do is really set the bar on how to work with Indigenous communities and how to define how they hold their stories and how to integrate that with the more Western models. Next slide, please.
So as we look through these slides, you'll see how the look and feel of the game emerged. And we have original artifacts from the community, from museums, and then you'll see the game art. One interesting story is when we first started designing the character of Nuna, you know, we had hired concept artists that had worked on Disney films and Pixar films that we had used before, and they came up with beautiful renderings of Nuna, and we took them to the community, and they're like, well, these are beautiful, but that's Disney, that's not us. And so we threw them all away, and we found the guy who was, you saw him on the previous inclusive development side, Dima Verakova. He was from the Ukraine, had studied Indigenous art, was actually a sculptor, I believe, and then was working on video games, first-person shooters. And when we found him, and he spent a lot of time up in the community, getting to know the artists, looking at the art, this beautiful new look emerged, and it could have only happened through a deep inclusive development process. Next slide, please. So I think this is just a little bit of a mosaic, you know, storytelling. Amy, do you want to describe Scrimshaw? And what's interesting is that the top image is an actual Scrimshaw piece of art, and the bottom image is game art.
And so I have to say that this was, you know, I knew I trusted Eline Media when we started the game development process, but I really fell in love with them when I saw this pop up on the screen. So I had grown up around beautiful Scrimshaw, and it's very rare to find pieces like this. So Scrimshaw today, with our modern artists and all of their beautiful and meaningful, they tend to be a Scrimshaw of one picture, whereas historically we would use Scrimshaw to record stories. And so when I saw on screen the Scrimshaw come to life at the beginning of each chapter, I knew we had definitely hit on something special, because I had seen something that is somewhat of art that's being lost literally come to life on screen. And by using it to frame the story, it was completely in line and almost brought back that practice of using Scrimshaw for storytelling.
Next slide. So this is a traditional hunting bola. You know, this is something that we would have never come up as game makers on our own, but learning about these things, often with games. I mean, games are unique. You can step into a role, step into an identity. You have agency. You go into a problem space. You attempt things, you fail safely, you get feedback. I mean, those are attributes of games. But the core game mechanics are often verbs. If you think of, and they can be thinking verbs, they can be action verbs. And so we were looking for some action verbs, and the bola, you know, certainly had some interesting action verbs when it came to things like hunting. Next slide, please. Amy, do you want to describe? This is Sean, the creative director, and Minnie Gray. I love that picture of them just working together. It was very important from the very beginning that the game would be in the Inupiat language. I mean, we would translate it into a lot of languages, but that was very important. So Amy, maybe you can talk about that a little bit.
Yes, and so you can see in these slides some of the ways we've really brought the community into the actual game making and some of the storytelling in the game itself. And so Minnie Gray we brought her in to do interviews with her. She came with all these photos from her family and shared the stories around that. And she actually held a game controller, which I think she had no idea what to do with, but she was having fun. And then you see on the right side, the late James Nagiak and his wife, Anna Nagiak. James was a Inupiaq narrator on Never Alone, and it was really important for us to include the Inupiaq language, which is a language that doesn't have as many fluent speakers. When we made this game, there were only 3,500 fluent Inupiaq speakers left in Alaska. And so we wanted to hear our voice in the game, and we did it through James. Anna also helped kind of take the script of the game and worked with James on translating it into Inupiaq. And I have to say, and this is where Inupiaqs have a lot of humor around this stuff, is that there was a lot of fun those two had arguing between each other about the nuances of the language. And then they would get serious and then all of a sudden they'd break out laughing. And that's just part of who we are. And to be able to see that and record it was really special. Next slide, please. Next slide, yeah.
So it's a puzzle platformer based on the core arc of the Canucksiaq story, the story of the Endless Blizzard. We call it an atmospheric puzzle platformer. One of the things we did in the game that was very unique, and we didn't hit upon this until the very end. So we recorded all of our interviews on video and would watch them over and over and over again. And we realized watching these videos and hearing the elders and community members talk about their culture, we just wish that all the gamers could experience that because it was so powerful. And you can only do so much in an animated video game in terms of infusing the culture. So we decided late in the process that we were going to break these interviews up into short, 1.5 to 3 minute documentary shorts that when you play the game, when there's something that was specifically inspired, an owl flies away and it unlocks what we call as a cultural video insight. You don't have to watch it. We don't want to force the players to watch it. You don't have to watch it to solve a puzzle, but you can choose to watch it. It shows up in your menu. And we ended up creating 26 of these. We embedded in the game, essentially a full life documentary. And it turned out to be one of the most beloved parts of the game. And it's rare to have a documentary in a video game, and it reaches folks that PBS or BBC or Netflix might not reach through Xbox, PlayStation, Nintendo. So this is a little bit of a mosaic of the inclusive development process. And I think this will transition for those of you who haven't seen or played the game. We're going to start with the announcement trailer when we first announced the game. And then we'll go right into the first cultural insight that is in the game, which is a living people, living culture. And then we'll come back and talk a little bit about the impact of the game after we launched it.
Imanga kanga qoleaqtuaruulugut qaangiqsillaavlugi kinguneeptignum qoleaqtuapta kangiqsipkaruuga iglerusia nuna suli qanuq inuunaqput iluani Aglaan, suhraawat, utuqqat qoleaqtuat, alqarluutaat tatqamna aviktuarutaawitpat. Taamna sivunerivlu muuminga tiiraaliuqtu. Katikleerut qovirusuutiqartuanik iñugnik iñullaa ikayutik shamik, pikallar. Allaginin inyusinin avlan sivungat atir. Kangik sitaw kraw kaktugut. Asing kamna iling avictual lasigikput.
One of the things I think a lot of people need to understand is we aren't a museum piece. The Inupiaq people are a living people and a living culture. Even though we're in northern Alaska, which covers this vast area from Nome all the way over the Canadian border, is that there's this extreme value of interconnectedness and interdependence.
It's a hunting society, a gathering society from thousands of years.
This is what creates our culture.
That special relationship between humans and the natural world and the animals, and that it teaches you how to have a society that doesn't do too much harm to the world.
Love and respect for nature, for one another, for our elders. Very, very fundamental value, key to life.
Our values are something that bind us all. The importance of sharing with one another, the importance of spirituality, and the connection to the land, our traditions, how we hunt, sharing of stories and songs and dances.
I'm Inupiaq. I'm from the Arctic Ocean.
I am Inupiaq.
It's very important to me. It's who I am as a person.
And we're very proud of who we are, and we want to continue that.
Once we put out that announcement trailer, we got more people contacting us than any game I'd ever worked on, including the big AAA Activision games. And it was everything from Indigenous youth, super excited to see an authentic representation of their culture or a similar culture. It was folks that weren't Indigenous, that were really passionate about culture and games. It was university researchers, it was elementary school teachers, it was museums, it was foundations. And as Amy said, 5-6 years later, a week does not go by when somebody contacts us asking questions about Never Alone, doing a PhD on Never Alone, asking if we would speak to a class or at a conference. We are in dozens of museums around the world. You're going to hear some announcements very soon on some of the biggest museums in the world who are going to do major exhibits around Never Alone in the next year. And those are going to be very exciting announcements. And we're becoming part of the permanent collection of many museums. There's a lot of excitement around a potential Never Alone movie, around a sequel, around other platforms. It's just been remarkable. I mean, if we go back to the slides, we can talk specifically about some of the reach of the game and how it's seeping into popular culture, academic culture. So let's go to the next slide and we'll talk about very specifically. So again, like I say, you can watch the trailer online. This will give us some more time for questions.
If we go to the next slide, you can see some of the awards that we had. And Alan, you want to talk about these?
Yeah, so this was very exciting. We literally got nominated for, I believe, every major video game award. And these aren't just impact games or learning games or cultural games. This is competing with all of the AAA games that are out there. We won a BAFTA, which is a British Academy Award, which was very exciting. Ishmael Hope, our Alaska Native writer, gave his speech in his local language, which was wonderful. And Dima, the wonderful art director, the two of them accepted the award. We're actually creeping up on 5 million downloads at this point. We're still doing deals with the major distributors. So the game is still selling. We were 75 best of the year lists, which was super, super exciting. Next slide, please. As I mentioned, we've had over 1,000 articles in both gaming press and popular media. The New Yorker has made a film about it. The Future of Storytelling has made a film about it. And they've made a film about the inclusive development process. You know, Twitch and YouTube were just coming online around the time we launched the game in 2014, Christmas 2014, but we were right away getting millions of views, and it was fascinating to watch the gamers' faces as they played the game. We have lots of lovely fan art. We still get fan art for Never Alone. We were a question on the US game show, Who Wants to Be a Millionaire? We have people dressing up as Nuna and Fox cosplay at shows, which is always delightful. Next slide. Yeah, this is Ishmael and Dima accepting the British Academy Award, which was very exciting. Next slide. So we originally released the game on Xbox, PlayStation, Nintendo, and PC through Steam. So when the game came out, all the other platforms wanted it. So Apple and Google really wanted us to put it on mobile. We didn't really design the game for mobile, but we did port it to mobile. Apple made us the game of the day more than once, which just gave us an insane amount of exposure. We were loaded on all the machines in the Apple store, which was really fun to walk into an Apple store and see Nuna and Fox across the tables. And we still continue to put the game on new platforms because a lot of platforms didn't exist when we released Never Alone. So it's always very exciting to put it on the new platforms. It's technically challenged because we built the game in Unity. We have to upgrade all the technology to the new version of Unity. So it's not rocket science, but we want the game to reach as many people as possible. Next slide, please. As I mentioned, lots of academic reports. These are just a few. If you Google Never Alone academic reports, you'll get lots and lots of them. They're always fascinating to read. The team at Eline and Inlet Tribal Council always takes the time to talk to the researchers. And it's always interesting to see the insights. We're in lots of game books. We did develop a curriculum guide that is in the Alaska schools, and that's available for free. Next slide. These are just a few of the museums that we're in. There are dozens all over the world. And that's always really exciting when we get a museum outreach, and we've gotten better and better at creating museum installations that not only show the game, but really describe the inclusive development process. And like I say, there's going to be some really exciting announcements coming out soon of some new museums that will be featuring Never Alone. Next slide, please. Amy, do you want to? Amy, do you want to talk about how the game turned into a much deeper partnership between Eline and CITC and all the other things that we're doing together, even beyond games?
Yeah, I would love to talk about that. You know, we always say that CITC and Eline dated first, and then we got married. And so through the making of the game, we really fell in love with the video game industry, and in particular with the way and the values that Eline displayed in the making of Never Alone with us. And so we decided to take our intellectual property in the game and turn it into a ownership into Eline Media. So we merged our management team and our assets, and CITC now has a 30% stake in Eline Media. And my boss, Gloria O'Neill, serves as the executive chair, and I currently serve as the chief financial officer for Eline too. You know, I think that's just a piece of it. That's a business piece side of it. And I think for the Alaska Native culture, and this is really shown in our language, like the word for gift in Inupiaq, which is Aitun, is really about a gift, but it's also a responsibility and a burden. And so it's the idea that a gift is circular and that when you give a gift, you show respect. And we really felt like the partnership with Eline represented that circular nature of being connected and interdependent with each other. And they did some really amazing things for us, not only through the game, but they connected us with the MIT Center for Bits and Atoms. And they led the way, and Alan's brother, Neil, actually started the Fab Lab movement. And so we were able to open a Fab Lab in Anchorage, Alaska, and really have it connected and focused on our youth. I'm happy to say that we started that over 5 years ago, and we're just now getting ready to open and start renovation on a super fab lab, doubling the size of our fab lab and the number of opportunities we provide. But beyond that, they also really helped us rethink about how we do our services and how we design them and how we connect with our people. And so through experimental design, which is under the Alaska Native World Build, you can see Alex McDowell there, we were able to connect with a methodology of strategic planning and community building that kind of blew our mind. Experimental design has been started working with Eline, and we wanted to see as part owners in Eline what this was all about. So we went down to California to meet Alex, and we walked into his workspace and we looked around and saw the imagery, and we felt like we were in a tribal setting. And Alan, I don't know if you want to talk a little bit about the world build process, and then I can talk a little bit about what it's done for us.
Sure. So Alex is a well-known Hollywood production designer. He's done about 26 movies. He's probably best known for a Steven Spielberg movie called Minority Report, where they actually didn't have the screenplay when they started that. And so Alex and a team of scientists, futurists, designed the city of Washington, D.C. in 2050 before they had the story. And in designing the city, looking at all the systems, they came up with things like driverless cars, gesture-based controls, like all these new innovations that came out of the inclusive world building process. And Alex realized at the end of that, they could have told tons of stories in that. They could have made games, movies, books, strategic planning. And so he's been teaching world building at USC for 10 years. And we now have a joint venture with Eline, which is a design agency where we work inclusively with communities to ask what if, why not questions, do a lot of research, and then often using game engines, visualize and design worlds, start to tell stories in those worlds to humanize them, to imagine possible preferred futures and stable steps towards building those futures.
And what I would say is, when we first met Alex, we fell in love with the idea of how he brings people together to work on projects and like this. And so we actually embarked on our own world building process where we brought him up to Alaska, brought together youth, elders, and community leaders, even brought him up to UQAC too, to help us really think about what the future of our rural communities in Alaska could be. And so what I loved about it was that we got to put our youth in a place, our elders in a place that said, what do you want to see in the future? And really amazing ideas and new thought processes. But what I loved the most was the overarching answer from our youth was, we want more time with our elders, which is just great. And if we can go to the next slide, what we've done with that world build process is we've really allowed it to inform how we design our services, what services we do, and how the participants and our people connect to those opportunities. So here you can see CITC's vision statement, which is, we envision a future in which all of our people, especially our youth, the stewards of our future, have access to vast opportunities and have the ability, confidence, and courage to advance and achieve those goals, infused with an unshakable belief in their endless potential. And what I love about our partnership with Eline is that this is just the beginning of what we're doing together. And I think it's because of the way they worked with us, they showed us how we can in turn design our services with our own people and do things in a more innovative way that really have helped us progress forward. Well, I just wanted to say thank you, and it's Quiana or Quianapak in NUPIAC, and I appreciate your time, and I look forward to any questions you have. Alan, I don't know if you have any closing thoughts.
No, it's been a life-changing experience. I think if you talk to anybody at Eline or anyone who worked on Never Alone, it's truly a wonderful life-changing experience. And much like Amy talked about how Some of our methodologies, some of our partnerships have been helpful in their roadmap. We've learned so much from our Alaska Native partners. Every game we do now is through inclusive development, whether we're working with scientists and marine scientists or domain experts in a specific area or another culture. And we are actively looking at turning Never Alone into a sequel and an anthology of cultural games. We've learned so much from CITC and our Alaska Native partners in terms of how we do what we do. So look forward to any questions.
Kuyana, did I say it correctly? Madame Claude?
Yes.
I'm guessing I have a big French accent, even in the UPAC. Thank you very, very much, both of you. Very, very fun. You make it sound very, very easy. And I know that if there are game developer in the attendance, most of us think of game developing like chaos, like, don't forget, I'm sorry, I'm reading a comment. I'll read after. So here's the first question for me. From the get-go, you started the story with the Endless Blizzard and sort of a platformer game. And this seems like it gelled like right away. Was that the case? Were the game that were they mechanics, genre that you explored before, or the story? How did you end up making that platform game with that story? I don't know if basically, what was the process between you, Alan, and the CITC going, we can make games. We don't know about games. This is a first-person shooter. This is that kind of game. And then both of you sort of trying to find out that perfect marriage, I guess. That's what the analogy you use. So can you talk to us about a bit that process? Was that right away, or were they trial and error?
Yeah, I think, well, let me start off with saying how we ended up with Canuck Sayuka is we literally shipped Sean Veshy a box of books of our transcribed stories. And he read them and he dove into them. And I think he fell in love with them. But I would say, we didn't know how to do an inclusive development process when we started. We were creating that process together, which is really interesting if you think about the anchor value of Never Alone being interdependence. We really built that interdependence through the inclusive development process. And Alan, I don't know if you want to talk about what it was like as a game industry leader, walking into creating an inclusive development process.
Yeah, it's actually a great question, and it's very relevant as we think about building on the franchise. So as Amy mentioned, the team, all of us read a lot of the stories, which was wonderful because there's a lot of elements of the stories that appear in the game that weren't necessarily specifically in the Canuck story, which is a relatively short story. It's only a few pages long. But when we read the stories, as I mentioned, Sean and the designers were looking for stories that had a sense of a narrative, that had verbs, that had action verbs that could be turned into game mechanics. And we didn't start knowing that we were going to make a puzzle platform game, but it quickly emerged that the sort of platform genre is very accessible to a wide variety of gamers. Young people can play platform games, older people, a lot of people play Mario all the way back to games like Pitfall. So it felt like a very accessible genre. It also had a linear arc, and we knew in this game we wanted to have a linear arc. We really wanted to tell the story of the Endless Blizzard from start to finish. And that the platform genre could have some puzzles. So early on, it felt like it was promising. We actually did stop in the middle and did an analysis of some of the more sort of systemic gameplay type mechanics. And it really was too much to push the puzzle platform genre in that direction. So we ended up doing a fairly traditional puzzle platform genre. I think in general, it was a really good decision. It gave us a focus. It enabled us to be able to scope the game. We had actually all made games in that genre before, so it was a very comfortable genre. Sean and I had worked together on Pitfall, if you remember that game from way back when.
No.
But it's a similar genre. That said, one of the things that we did wrong, I would say, and it was really a question of time because there's the inclusive development process takes longer. Doing 26 documentaries takes longer. A lot of things took longer. The game is fairly hard, and in the puzzle platform genre, there's an audience that likes really hard games, like if you know games like Limbo and Braid. And so we wanted to please the indie gamers. And so we made some of the sort of Twitch platform mechanics and puzzles fairly hard. But when we got 1,000 articles and all the press, and it's a young Inupiaq girl and an adorable fox, we had young girls that wanted to play the game. Often it was a little bit too hard. And because it was linear, they couldn't necessarily finish it. So in hindsight, I wish we had an easy and difficult mode or a hint system, because then everybody could have finished the game. So little things like that you learn as you go through the process. But in general, I think it was the right decision for the game at that time.
Thank you very much. There's a question in the chat. I'm going to keep it for a second. I just want to bounce back on the fact that you made the game maybe a bit too hard. And I know in the game industry, there's a tug of war between serious gaming and commercial gaming. You sort of hinted at that at the beginning of your presentation, that you were making more a commercial, and correct me if I misquote you, but you were making more like a commercial venture, like it was a game that you were making. And for me, making a game that is more fun, using the colloquial expression, was for me part of the success of Never Alone. So in your honest opinion, or in your opinion in hindsight and using a crystal ball, if you made the game too easy or too easy to finish, do you think it would have made the game go into the serious mode and people would say, oh, it's a game about learning something, it's not as fun, as opposed to having a really fun game that you learn something? I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, it makes total sense. And I think there's a couple questions embedded in there, and we debate it all the time. We have two divisions at Eline. One is our entertainment division that is entertainment first. We're competing with all the other entertainment games out there, and people come to it because they didn't necessarily wake up in the morning saying, I want to learn about the Alaska Native community. They came to the game because they wanted to play a really fun game, and they might have been intrigued that, wow, this game looks different, feels different. People like games and movies that take you into new worlds and give you great experiences, but it is entertainment first. We have another line of products that's purposeful learning first, and it is design and with scaffolding and support for teachers and moderators. And we found you have to be very clear on what you're doing. It's very hard to do both well. So when I say the game too hard, you're absolutely right. If we had made the game too easy, it still would have been beautiful. And I think a platform puzzle gamers that like hard games, what I wish we had done is had difficulty levels so that we could appeal to everybody, and that there might be a hint system, so that if you're having trouble with a particular puzzle, the hardcore gamers, they're comfortable with that. They just wouldn't do it or wouldn't go on the internet. So I think there was a way to still be entertainment first, still be a game that competes with all the other consumer games. But the differentiation is we're bringing you a really fun game that is infused with the culture and done inclusively with the culture. So yes, it is hard to compete because we're asking for people's discretionary time and discretionary dollars, and there's a certain bar. And also, when you release a game, an indie game, the way you get people aware of the game, probably the two top ways to make people aware of the game are placement on the e-stores. So that would be Steam or the Epic Store, or Xbox, PlayStation, Nintendo have digital stores, Google, Apple have digital stores, and they feature games. It's a blend of curation and algorithm, but they have to be a certain quality for them to feature it. And for streamers, for Twitch and YouTube folks to play the game, it has to be a good game. Good intentions aren't good enough for them to stream it. So you are absolutely right that this game was entertainment first. But like I say, I wish we had multiple difficulty levels. Amy, any thoughts on that?
I think one of the things that we realized in the making of the game is that in order to really know your audience, you have to really think of all angles. And I think, from a CITC perspective, we were really pleased with the game. It was a very hard game to play. I actually sat down with my husband to play it through, and when it got really hard, I just swapped controllers with him so we could finish it together. But I think really where I feel like we hit success not only from a commercial standpoint, from an impact standpoint, is the fact that I do think that it's inspired a new genre of games and it's set the bar high for it. And so when I think about lessons learned, I think it's just exactly what Alaska Natives would do. And that's how we survived in such a harsh climate. We would try something, we'd fail, we'd try again, kind of like games. It's a safe place to fail and try again. And the whole game making process with Eline really mirrored that as well.
Thank you. There's a question from the chat room. How did you come up with the game features that are culturally related? That bounces off one of my questions, but basically it's really easy to make a game, and we have tropes, I would say, go-to symbols, like you, Alan, you were speaking about Mario, you know, the double jump, stuff like that. How did it go between the UQAC and the game developer to the game? I can see the game developer going, we're going to put like a red light here because that's what we do in game design. And of course, the elders, that lovely lady, probably went, no, we don't have a red light over here, find something else. Can you talk about that process, about the translation of the game world into the UQAC culture and the translation of the UQAC culture into the game world? That wasn't, again, it looks so easy the way you did it.
Yeah, there's lots of stories there. There's lots of examples. I'll pick one or two, and Amy can pick one or two. I'll talk about one that's very relevant because, you know, we're doing some other stuff in the franchise right now. And so literally yesterday, we had a whole conversation about this. In the game, well, the biggest one is 2-player local co-op interdependence. Neither Nuna nor Fox can finish the game themselves. I've already mentioned that. But when you play the game, you meet spirit helpers. And Amy can talk more about how important spirit helpers are in the community. And we had a game designer that really wanted you to be able to push a button and call up the spirit helpers. You know, push a button, call them up. And that would be a typical thing you would do in a platformer game. But that's not how spirit helpers are accessed. It's a much more thoughtful process. And so how do you translate that into a puzzle platform game? What we ended up doing, and not everyone necessarily notices it, but they feel it, which is when the Fox character has to move ahead of Nuna, and it's Fox's proximity to the spirit helpers that can slowly access them. And we purposely did the animation very slow and gentle as the spirit helpers come down. And it's only through Fox's proximity because Nuna doesn't have that ability at this point. And it's subtle. Many people play the game, they never notice it, but they do feel it. There's a rhythm there. And, you know, when we first introduced the spirit helpers, it didn't work with the community. They just looked at it. It did not feel right. But when we came back with the Fox making the connection and the slow animation, it just felt so much better. And that's an example of just a classic platform mechanic that we had to rethink. We had a lot of discussion over should Nuna be a boy or a girl? Because in the original story, it's a boy. And there is not a sidekick animal. And we originally had a wolf. And it was sort of asymmetric, the Nuna and the wolf, in terms of the balance. And so, you know, when we spent time up in UQAC, which was called Barrow at the time, there were lots of Arctic foxes running around, and they were just adorable. And so, but there was a lot of debate, which Amy can talk about, in terms of fox versus wolf. So Amy, do you want to talk about some of those challenges?
Yeah, you know, I think what was really interesting is that throughout the gameplay, I mean, we based Never Alone on traditional oral Alaska Native stories, but what came up was a mix of traditional values and then modern challenges. So if we talk about the spirit helpers for a little bit, the original mechanic was you hit a button and you call up the spirit. Well, that's not really in line how we see our connection to Sia, which is everything from the land and above, and really is our representation of how we're connected with nature. You can't call upon powers. Everyone may have different abilities to connect with Sia and to nature around them. Certain individuals had more affinity, but really it was the spirit helpers that allowed you to really understand and connect with nature. And so changing that mechanic was really key and a really important conversation in our community. That was about a traditional value. Moving to the fox, it was about a modern challenge, and UQAC and other rural Alaska Native communities, if a fox comes into town, it usually means that they have rabies, and they teach their kids to stay away from them so that the kids don't get rabies. And so that was a real like a pain point, I think. But I think what was wonderful about it is we listened to them, we showed them the gameplay, we went back and Eline worked on modeling different animals. We brought the game back up literally, physically to UQAC to game test with them. And they said, well, wait a second, the fox really works. Let's go back. We'll use it as a way to talk to our kids about what's different in video games versus real life. So that was really amazing. And I think that it was those type of hard decisions where there wasn't a clear-cut answer, but the conversations around it really deepened the relationship with Eline and the community, and really helped make the game special.
There were funny things that emerged that we didn't get into the game, but when we first put together those short documentaries, the cultural insights, there was one insight about the sky people, the Aurora Borealis who turns into the sky people. And there's a story that's relayed in the cultural insight as to how they would come down, and if you didn't have your hood all the way up, they would chop your head off and play football with your head. And it's an evocative story. But when players, when we were play testing it and they heard that story, they kept trying to find a game mechanic to pull Nuna's hood up because it's partially down. And it was too late to put that in. But it's an example of when you do a game like this, you need a lot of time to play test, to really see how people not only experience the play of the game, the joy, the fun, but also the culture. And as we play tested it and saw people's reactions throughout the whole game, there were whiteboards full of ideas of things that we could have pursued.
You take a picture of those whiteboards?
We do, and a lot of those will appear in future versions.
Excellent. There's a question from the panel. What advice would you give to a developer that wants to incorporate culturally inclusive content in their games? Are the other developer doing it right now?
Well, I would say from an Indigenous standpoint, don't make the game without a community or without representation. And each Indigenous community is going to have different values and norms and protocols around utilizing stories or artwork. And so it's really important for the developer to understand what those values and norms are, and so that they can work together to make it. And so it's that idea of nothing about us without us. And Alan, do you want to talk about it from a developer perspective?
Yeah, I mean, we were very fortunate to have found Amy, Gloria, and the Cook Inlet Tribal Council. It's critical to find, as Amy members, stakeholders in the community that can truly represent the community, because all communities are diverse. And so understanding not only the individual's perspective as if they're a consultant or a member of the team, but their ability to really find the people in the community, as Amy mentioned, to navigate all the questions that will come up. And so I think that's really important. And then on the development side, that that folks really understand that it is truly a collaborative process. It will slow down the process a bit, but better things will come out of it if you really, really embrace the process.
Thank you. On my side, one small question just to add up to this one. Having worked with the new community here in Quebec, I know that countless times I put my foot in my mouth. And thank God for the patience of Marco I was working with. Can you tell us how to be better prepared? The question is probably more for Amy then. How to be better co-worker with you, with the community, because we obviously come here. I know that I'm speaking not for Alan, but for the rest of the community, that we come in with big shoes. So any advice for us how to be better at that?
And I think this was something that we learned along the way too. And I think when you enter into a community, and whether you're bringing ideas about a video game or even just a new business, it's really important to honor the community and their wishes and voices. And the way I think we found to do it is partially, this is why I was in the lead cultural ambassador role, is that before the design team would go into UQAC or meet with a new group of community members, there was always like a planning session, like here's the do's and don'ts, like never cut off an elder when they're speaking. And so, or, you know, forwardings, like, you know, there's some tension around this particular topic. And so I think it actually ended up becoming really natural when we went in to UQAC or met with people in Anchorage, because we were very upfront with the community members that CITC doesn't know how to make video games. So we're learning from Eline, and Eline is here to learn from you. And I think it was that prep and constant conversation that really helped. Alan, I don't know if you have thoughts on that.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good summary. And I guess the one thing I would add is, you know, the fact that we worked for months together doing the kind of landscape and opportunity analysis is we just got to know each other. So it just didn't feel like, okay, this is a business partnership, we're doing this. We really got to know each other. We got to know each other's families. And that just, if you're really building a true partnership, you know, this stuff is hard. We go through all sorts of ups and downs, and it just helps to have that personal connection.
Thank you. That's a very good answer. Thank you very, very much. There's a question from Omar Banitaha. I'm not sure. I'm going to ask the question. What ways did you address and meet young players in terms of their age and gender? Maybe Mr. Omar can specify. I think there's a part missing in the question. Or does it make sense to you, Alan or Amy?
Well, I would say, and I might be misunderstanding the question, so I apologize if I do. You know, from the game testing perspective, it was really important for us to have the game in the high school, for instance, in UQAC, so that the community who was making with it, that the youth were at the heart of testing it. I think as they went through the game testing piece in the studio piece, there was a whole myriad of ways they ensured that they were bringing in the right type of player for the game. And Alan, I don't know if you want to talk about that side of it.
Well, yeah, so a couple things. We think a lot about gender representation in the games. And one of the reasons why Sean proposed changing the boy to a girl is there's not a lot of young girl, strong protagonists in games. And if you look at Gina Davis, the actress, has a nonprofit called See Jane, and she's done really powerful research on gender and other identity in popular media, mostly movies and TVs, but they're moving into games. And it's remarkable when you see, for example, a female CSI character, how many young women want to pursue that career. I mean, she's mapped this out with rigorous research. So we do think about who is the protagonist, how the protagonist is visualized, and that does affect, I believe, the interest in accessibility, say, to young boys or young girls. I mean, there's no exact science to this, but we're very sensitive to trying to include, to make the game as accessible to as diverse an audience. We're thinking a lot about co-op gameplay and the idea of parents playing with kids, grandparents playing with grandkids, because we think intergenerational gameplay is incredibly powerful and incredibly joyful. So that's another lens on, you know, how do you attract diverse players or diverse combinations of players, both through the game mechanics, how the game is literally designed, as well as the genre, the protagonist, and things like that. There's quite a bit of people researching this now, and there's good research out there as well.
Thank you. I'm going to jump on this one and continue on that subject. You talk about social impact, and it's pretty obvious for me, at least, that around the world, Never Alone had a huge impact. How we design game, how we think about game, and if for any length of strength, I won't try that sentence in English, but it's influenced a lot of people thinking that we can do much better with games, that it is actually a cultural artifact. I think you put it in your presentation. But I'm curious, Amy, closer to home, what kind of impact did it have within the community? You talk about the Fab Lab, you talked about more time with the youth, that like the youth wanted to spend more time with the elder. Are there other examples of like closer to home of the impact of the game?
You know, what I would say, you know, we didn't design the back end of the game to really measure how people reacted to it from our community. But what I've seen in the community is that when they're talking about what's possible, like if we think at it first at the broader community level, companies are now seeing that you can have a voice, be Indigenous in popular media, whether it's radio, TV, movies, or video games. So we've seen a lot of inspiration on that end. I'm very happy that there's now Molly of Denali, and I got to meet the Indigenous writers working on that. They're just really amazing. So I do think that it inspired some of our younger writers and people in media to not be afraid to jump into a project like this. I think from like a local Anchorage impact, what I know is that our youth programs, which we engage with about 2,000 youth every year, one of the things that constantly pops up besides Fab Lab is the Never Alone and when is it coming out and I want to play more of it. I think there's a lot of excitement around that because it's our youth don't necessarily have a lot of positive images in the media to grasp onto. So when you see Never Alone, you see your stories, your people, you hear the voice of your people and the values of your people in a game. It really helps them build their self-confidence and helps them be proud of who they are. From UQAC, I know that when we went back up with the World Build team, there was a lot of celebration again around, Never Alone was so fun to do. And I think there is a great deal of pride in UQAC that they were such a large part in making the video game. And the best thing for me was that they were proud of it because it was really kind of scary for me as an UQAC individual to be going and making a game in a space where it hadn't been done before, and I didn't want to appropriate my own culture. And I think that was probably the best outcome I could ask for. But I will say from an organization standpoint, we are just very proud that one of the ways we measure impact on these types of investments is it creating conversation, is it steering conversation, and Never Alone continue to do that 6 years after the fact. And this is just one example of that.
Well, one other big one that I wish we were doing more of, but we are definitely doing and will continue to do more of is youth game making programs because you know the tools have become so much more accessible to make games that, and not every kid, but a lot of kids want to make games, and there's great learning when you make games. So we have a grant right now with the Cook Inlet Tribal Council to do youth game making programs so that, you know, soon they won't need us because they'll have their own generation of game makers that grew up making games. And that's happening all over the world and in many Indigenous communities. There's a lot of great youth game making programs.
Follow-up question from the chat. Have you been able to share the game with remote Indigenous community who don't have you don't have trusted internet access or computer capable of running the game?
That actually has been a bit of a challenge. I would say that it was one of the requests we consistently gotten. You know, there are a few times when people reached out, we were able to do a download of it and mail it out, but it wasn't, you know, easy to do on scale. We did make a copy available to every member of the UQAC community and to the shareholders of Arctic Slope Regional Corporation, which was one of our partners in their Alaska Native Corporation. But I would say that is hard. I think in Alaska, more and more communities are getting access to internet, but in other parts of the US and probably in Canada too, there's still that underlying issue of broadband and internet access. And so we haven't quite cracked that nut.
Yeah, I mean, we have done programs in very, very remote communities, but we've had to bring all the equipment ourselves. So as Amy said, it hasn't been scalable. They've been one-off opportunities. And I feel bad because, I mean, it's been great and inspiring, But then the youth that are inspired, they want to make stuff like that. And you can do it. The tools are out there now. It's just a lot harder if you don't have broadband and a high-end computer. We are looking at things like mobile development and ways to make it as accessible as possible with lower-end computers and intermittent internet. But we've got a long way to go, and that enabling infrastructure really is kind of critical for the type of games that we make.
Do you find leverage with the government because of the success of Never Alone? Does the government is more interested, or I don't know if my question is weirdly put, but if you build it, they will come. So if there's an interest, if there are people behind it the way you are, as the government responding to you, or?
I would say, there's certain areas of the government where it's heightened our reputation with the government. So for example, being able to show how a tribal nonprofit organization can move to more self-sufficiency through revenue streams like video games, really appealed to some of the efforts that are really around employment and self-sufficiency in the federal government. And in other parts, it's really served as a way to really show how you can allow Indigenous communities to design their own processes. And so a lot of tribes across the US they often, if they want to go after competitive federal grants, there's a box the feds want us to be in. And you do your services this way in your community, and that's the way you do it because we're giving you the money. But what we have seen is that they're more open if you can demonstrate there's a well thought out process on how to design a service with the community, that they're more open to. But it's not systemic change. It's like baby steps, if even the first one.
But we are seeing some of the changes. We're actually working on a collaboration with the Mississippi Band of Choctaw Indians right now. And even in the time that we've been working with them and working with their youth, because we're actually starting with a bunch of youth game programs, they now have a state-of-the-art VR lab. It's amazing, where they're doing development on I think they have both Unity and Unreal, and there's a VR lab. And that's happened within the last year plus that we've been working with them. And it's a combination of tribal leadership, government partnerships, all sorts of different mechanisms that are creating the enabling ecosystem. The one thing I'll tell you is we've never gone into a community where there isn't some youth that are eager to express themselves through multiple media, including games. And there's an incredible wellspring of talent and stories to be told. So, we're always happy to talk to governments, tribal leadership, to stress the fact that we promise you, if the enabling infrastructure is there will be a lot of talent, stories, and it becomes workforce development for the older kids.
Thank you. Sorry, I'm sometimes poking at the chat to see the next question. In terms of revenue downloads, how are the numbers split between PC and OS X versus mobile version?
So we originally launched on PC and console, and early on, because we wanted to make sure that the game was profitable, we wanted to reach as many folks as possible, because as Amy said, part of our theory of change was that this game reached millions and millions of players, so the Alaskan Native youth could see their culture reflected in a very popular game. So we took some buyouts early on from Sony and Microsoft on PlayStation and Xbox that enabled us to reach millions of gamers. And they were good deals. I mean, they paid us a lot of money, but they probably, had we not done those deals, we would have had fewer players, but more revenue. Because we reached millions of players, which was super exciting, and it grew the band. So based on that, I would say that the largest percentage is console, Xbox and PlayStation, then PC. Mobile is relatively small. But what's interesting is because Apple and Google gave us so much exposure, there's 1 million apps and games on the App Store, and being game of the day is a big deal. But we didn't originally design the game for mobile. Most of the successful mobile games are free to play, and this is a paid game. And it's not the type of game that you come back to every week or every month. So, we did well on mobile, and we're thinking a lot about how to leverage mobile moving forward, but it's a much smaller percentage of mobile gamers. That said, a lot of people saw the images of Nuna and Fox, and so the number might be as large in terms of awareness of Nuna and Fox, but it's a smaller number of people who've actually played on mobile devices.
Time is running, we're running out of time slowly. Question for Amy, it's a really good one. How did you get the community to become involved in the project?
Yeah, that was a really interesting one. And it started, first of all, with the board of Inlet Tribal Council. And so we have a 17-member board, and it's a good mix of elders and young adults. And we weren't sure how they were going to take it and how they were going to be, how open they were going to be to it. But we actually, with the board, we did a 2-day workshop with them. Eline came up, talked to them about it, and then our then chair, Claire Swan, turned to us and said, stop making excuses, just get it done, because if it was easy, everyone would be doing it. So that gave us our marching orders, and you don't tell Claire, who just turned 90, by the way, that no. So you go make it happen, and you do it good, and you do it right. But the next step was really to start making the connections in the community. And we had to look at all areas of the community. So we started off with the business community, and through the business community, we were able to find out who the education connections were and who the cultural connections were, who the hunters. And so it's all about recreating those traditional connections you have in traditional village life in Alaska, but doing it in a modern setting. And you know, honestly, across a broad geographic area from Seattle all the way up to the furthest part in Alaska. So,
thank you very much. It's 55, so it's time to wrap up. There's a question. It's a good question to wrap up, actually, because my closing statement is supposed to be, do you want to say, Amy, Alan, one final word? And if people want to continue the conversation with you, or as you said, Alan, you get invitation every week. There's somebody asking, I think it's only, I'm not sure. I'm the program chair of the Foundation of Digital Game conference. They want to invite you to do to go to an online presentation. So what's the best way to contact you and to keep the conversation going? And do you have any closing statement for us?
Amy, do you want to go first?
So I don't know if we can share my email address, or you can go to cixi.org, and there's a CIC info link. You can email us there to connect with me. But always happy to field questions, always happy to talk about Never Alone. It's like one of the biggest blessings I think I've had in my life and in my professional career. And I know, Alan, we have a whole way to connect through Eline.
Yeah, so I'm putting my email in chat, so you can email me directly. It's ag@elinemedia.com. So it's now in for everybody. In terms of conferences, you can send it to me and I'll forward it. We do have a link on the Eline Media website, and we do review it. Like Amy said, we do get these fairly often. We would be happy to be part of the event. Our marketing people can coordinate getting you a build, getting the build set up, figuring out all the logistics if you need art from the game for promotion. So you can either do it directly through me and I'll forward it to our marketing department who handles events, or you can do it through the website, either way. But we would be honored and happy to participate.
Thank you very much, Alan. Thank you very much, Amy. I would like to thank the consulate also, Julia, Kate, Katie, and everybody else. Ben, thank you. That was very, very insightful, this conversation. And everybody have a good day and a good afternoon.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.